And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Virtual Voices. We are going to get started. I'm Elizabeth Pruch. I have the pleasure of ensuring that our alumni of the Leadership Foundation stay engaged. One of the reasons we started Virtual Voices back in March was for that reason specifically, so that from the comfort of your home, you could stay up to date and informed on really important topics. As time went on, we realized the content coming out of Virtual Voices was so impactful and rich that we have opened this up since to the community. Our B Civic members, chamber members are also welcome to attend. So thank you to all of you for being here from wherever you are coming from. We're thrilled to have you. I have a few Zoom reminders for you just to start off. We will be recording the session, as I said, and we will send this out to you after the session. It'll be probably next week. We ask that you stay muted. We are going to use the chat feature quite a bit. So if you have questions, if you have resources, if you have reactions to anything you're learning or hearing, we would love to see them in the chat feature. Recommend you switching to speaker view. Today is going to be a little bit different, you guys. If you are a Virtual Voices regular, you know that this is a very much a conversational opportunity with our speakers. Redlining today is such an important history and some learning. So we are going to have our speakers today do a short presentation. There are some visuals, there's some data, there are things that we need to know in order to have a robust conversation. So we're starting off a bit different than usual, but we really want to hear what you have to say. So we're also going to leave plenty of time for the Q&A, which is what makes Virtual Voices so rich. So be ready to ask questions, take notes. We'll also send out recaps, as I said. If you have any technical questions, please ask Megan Vivier. She is hosting this for us. Thank you, Megan. And then I would like to thank our sponsors. We all have sponsors for things we do. We have individual sponsors. We have corporate sponsors that mean the world to us. They care very deeply about the work that the foundation does and specifically about our leadership alumni community. Molson Coors Beverage Company, Southwest, and TIAA have been longtime partners of the work we do here. And want to ensure that you all have this opportunity to continue to learn. So thank you to our sponsors. We simply couldn't be here without you. Thank you very much. And now I get to introduce these three amazing individuals and leaders. I'm going to quickly read a bio for each of them, and then I'm going to hand it over to them to run through their presentation so we can all learn and start becoming more knowledgeable here. So Katie McKenna, thank you so much for joining us. Katie is the Senior Program Director at Enterprise Community Partners, leads the organization's work to advance racial equity through community development and affordable housing programs in the Denver metro region. She previously was the Director of Community Development at Habitat for Humanity of Metro Denver. Katie has experience in affordable housing policy, program evaluation, affordable multifamily development, and affordable home ownership. This is why she is here. Her bio speaks for her. Thank you, Katie, so much. And then Maria, I knew I was going to do this, Maria. I did it again. Sepulveda, I apologize, is with Habitat for Humanity of Metro Denver. She's the Vice President of Community and Government Partnerships. She leads Habitat's advocacy program and collaborates with community and government partners in the furtherance of the organization's mission and vision. Maria manages Habitat's government grants and community land trust teams. Maria was very helpful here today also in bringing these three individuals together. So Maria, thank you so much for your leadership role here today. I appreciate that. And Jonathan Capelli. Jonathan is the Executive Director of the Neighborhood Development Collaborative, a coalition of 17 nonprofit affordable housing organizations in Metro Denver, and the founder of Capelli Consulting, a public policy consultancy. Previously, Jonathan worked for the Urban Land Conservancy in real estate acquisition and community outreach. His areas of focus are housing policy and programs, environmental sustainability, and community development. And we're also very proud to call him a LD 2018 alum. So thank you, Jonathan, for being here. Thank you to all three of you. We're ready and excited to hear what you have to say. Before you share your screen, Katie, I would love the audience to use this chat feature in this moment as we get started to let us know why you're here today. Why do you care to be here to learn about redlining? And how are you showing up today? We'd love to see that in the chat feature. And Katie, the mic is yours, if you will.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate those wonderful introductions. Sorry, I'm not good at multitasking. And thanks to everybody out there on Zoom for spending some time with us this morning. As Elizabeth mentioned, we are going to break a little bit from the Virtual Voices tradition by sharing a short presentation. We're going to spend a little bit of time this morning learning about our history and understanding how its legacy impacts our current state today, and then have a robust conversation and answer all of your questions about how we can chart a different and more equitable path for our future. So with that, I'm going to get started with a little bit of history, and much of what I'm going to share won't be new to many of you, but I do think it's helpful to kind of look at it all together in order to frame the conversation that we're hoping to have. So I'm going to share some historical context that creates a lot of the racial disparities that we see today, and I'll also share several maps of Denver that will help us understand the legacy of redlining and other racist policies and see how they play out in our community today. So to get started, let's take a look at Denver's redlining map. That's the map that's up on your screen. It is the map that the Homeowners Loan Corporation created back in 1938. So it still looks quite a bit like Denver, but it's a little bit different. It's a 1938 map of Denver. So this is the map that has become to be known as the redlining map. To look back in history a little bit, as part of the New Deal, a federal effort to bring the US out of the Great Depression, an effort to increase home ownership was launched, and that was to increase wealth building opportunities as well as a sense of security for American people coming out of a major depression. So, of course, coming out of a depression, banks were risk averse, and in order to increase lending to support that home ownership initiative, the government decided to insure mortgage loans. And like other lenders, the government wanted to mitigate their risk. And unfortunately, they did so primarily on the basis of race, which is how we got these redlining maps. So 80 years ago, the Homeowners Loan Corporation created these residential security maps of American cities greater than 50,000 people. And these maps documented how loan officers and appraisers and real estate professionals evaluated mortgage and lending risk during the era directly after the Great Depression, and also going into the 40s, 50s, and 60s, where there was a lot of residential development and the establishment of our suburbs in the US. So you can see the different colors: red, yellow, blue, and green. The red neighborhoods are the redlined neighborhoods. They were determined to be high risk or hazardous. These were also neighborhoods where the majority of the people who lived there were people of color. Yellow neighborhoods were also a high risk, not as high as the red neighborhoods, limited capital investment in these communities as well. Blue is where it started to open up a little bit, and green were the primarily white communities where lending was open and readily available. So it's really interesting to look at this. You can see from the map, the majority of the city of Denver and also every other city was actually red and yellow. So all of our investment is being directed to about 20% of our city, these red and blue areas, and you can imagine what a big impact this has on how a city grows and develops. One of the key things, redlining really buttress the segregated structure of our American cities, and we see this in Denver very strongly. So most of the neighborhoods, 74% actually, that the Homeowners Loan Corporation graded as high risk, or those red neighborhoods that you see on there 8 decades ago, they're still low and moderate income neighborhoods today. And additionally, those red neighborhoods on the map are still minority neighborhoods today. So 64% of the red neighborhoods are still primarily minority neighborhoods today. So not all cities were large enough to have these maps, so there were some other policies, so an underwriting manual, as well as racially restrictive covenants and zoning that kind of helped support the segregation and investment patterns that happened throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So moving on, this is a map of present day Denver, where you can see how racism is still evident in our housing system today and bleeds over into other areas. So what you're looking at on the screen, you can see the red, yellow, blue, and green outlines. Those are the outlines of the redlining map of the past. And it's overlaid on a map that is looking at educational outcomes, so high school completion and higher education attainment. I know the key is a little bit hard to read, but the lighter blue areas are where there are poor educational outcomes. And you can see that it overlaps strongly today with the redline neighborhoods of the past, despite the fact that redlining is no longer a practice. It was made illegal by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So moving on, we see this in many other areas. So this is a map of health and well-being. The lighter pink areas are where there are poor health outcomes. And you can see, just like the education map, there is a strong correlation between neighborhoods that were historically redlined and poor health outcomes today. So the last map, and I apologize, I haven't had time to overlay the redlining maps, but you've seen it enough now that you can kind of think about where it is. So this is a map of the impact of COVID-19 and the hospitalization rate of folks with COVID-19, and you can see that same pattern. The dark green is where there's a higher hospitalization rate, and so the formerly redlined neighborhoods today have higher rates of COVID-19, and we'll direct your attention to the right-hand side. We're also seeing some disparate impacts in homeownership and how many people have been able to make their mortgage payment on time or had their payment deferred. So of folks who were not able to make their July mortgage payment on time, 7% of those were white homeowners, 12% were Black, and 15% were Hispanic. We can think about that in the context of the redlining map. And then 80% of white homeowners who were not able to make their payment self-reported that their payment was deferred. 9% of historic and Latino homeowners reported that, and 0% of Black homeowners. And this is really important because we know that in our last recession we had there were racial disparities in both the impact and the outcomes of that recession, and we're already seeing some of those indicators early in the pandemic. And so the difference is right now we're looking at it and have the opportunity to create a different path forward. So that is an overview of history, and then some of the maps. Would welcome Maria or Jonathan if you have anything to add or any questions before we'll turn it over to Maria.
I think one thing that I'd like to add, and Katie, you pointed this out to me, and I've learned, I guess over the last year or so, is that not only do you see the outcomes, these gaps in education and health, following these redlining maps, but also gentrification and displacement, just filling right in those neighborhoods with the highest risks of displacement follow these same lines, and it just never ceases to amaze how everything just keeps, like you said, we could probably just draw in those lines with our imaginations. With every one of these gaps, one of these inequities that we see emerging.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And one of the reasons that I think we have a lot of conversation in Denver today about involuntary displacement associated with gentrification. And I think understanding the impacts of redlining, the impact on segregation that we still are feeling is really key to being able to changing that for the future. And really think that in order to have more equitable outcomes in our communities, the big task that we need to undertake is eliminating residential segregation.
I just wanted to add that it struck me how explicit redlining and some of these racist underwriting policies were. The maps show it pretty clearly, but I pulled up some language from the FHA underwriting manual. So ways to protect against adverse influences include prevention of business and industrial uses and inharmonious racial groups. The evaluator should investigate areas surrounding the location to determine whether or not incompatible racial groups are present. If the neighborhood is to retain its stability, it should be occupied the same social and racial classes. If children within a desirable community will be in a school district with low-income families, gives recommendations on paying a fee to send your kids, out of neighborhood to other schools. So both visually in terms of the maps and also in underwriting policy, it was incredibly explicit. That's all.
Yeah. Maria, I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, and I'm going to say, one of the things that actually eventually led me to coming to my role at Habitat a little over a year and a half ago is what I was seeing in the chat. And I think it was Ariel and a couple other folks mentioning this book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which I think I'm almost done with the second reading because it just never ceases to amaze. There is an excellent, and it's referred to in the chat, an excellent summary that if you don't have time to read through the 5 million footnotes that this professor cited in this book called Segregated by Design, and I just highly recommend you at least at a minimum take a look at that. Katie, you mentioned I was gonna say, every time I look at these maps, when I talked to Elizabeth about this presentation, I said, you've got to have Katie McKenna. You've got to have Katie McKenna come and share these maps. I know you don't like to do PowerPoints, but without seeing how explicit, how intentional this form of racial discrimination was, folks who doubt the existence of systemic and structural racism, it's just very hard to deny it when you see something like this. So, thank you, Katie, so much. And, the question I was going to ask you is, you look at how embedded this is, you look at how complicated it is, look at all these outcomes, all of the gaps, all of the racial inequities that emerge from these policies. And what's your one focus area that, or solution that gives you excitement that, hey, we can do something about this? And I think you shared it, but I'll give you another chance to maybe embellish a little bit about it.
Yeah, it's really hard to pick just one, but I would put a lot of emphasis on that we do still have a very segregated neighborhood system in Denver and also throughout the country, and eliminating residential segregation, not just through gentrifying historically Black and brown neighborhoods, but also through integrating historically white neighborhoods will go a long way to increase more equitable outcomes.
All right, I'm going to go forward because I'm looking at Elizabeth's face and I know that we're trying to keep on task. So
I'm just very interested. Please.
Yeah.
Look.
I know. I just want to make sure. There's so many questions popping up, and I want to make sure we give time. So I'm going to focus on the slide here that is really talking about the racial wealth gap. This is one of the outcomes that's a result of what Katie has just described, and wealth is such a critical measure of financial security, right? Because it's what buffers us from emergencies, from the ups and downs of income changes, of things like COVID unexpected things like COVID coming into our lives. And in addition, this is what prepares our families for the future. This is how we then create more wealth over time for our children and are able to pass from generation to generation social and economic opportunities. And so before I kind of get into this, just what this slide shows, I mean, you don't even know if you have to look at what the numbers say. It shows the income gap between white American families and Black American families. And if you took the Latino families, Native American families, you'd see similar gaps, growing gaps. So what comprises wealth in our country, one of the main components are what we have in home equity, what we have in savings and cash on hand and investments, retirement, and the stock market. And on the other end, it's that net worth minus our net liabilities as families. So credit card debt, school debt, medical debt. And when you look at this chart, if nothing else, I think what's really striking is the fact that it begins in the 60s or before the 60s really, and shows that over time, the income gap, the wealth gap between Black Americans, Black households and white households has just widened and widened and widened. And I think what's particularly disturbing is that what happened during this period of time, what happened as that gap was increasing at an exponential rate. The civil rights acts that have outlawed racial segregation, that have outlawed racial discrimination in the workforce, in housing, in education, those laws are on the books, right? And so it seems to be a little backwards and disturbing to see that all of these outcomes that Katie pointed to in education, gaps in health, continue to grow. So what we see is that these wealth gaps were driven by a variety of factors. And one of the top elements is home ownership rates, actually, housing security. Also in the mix is income, the disparities in income between Black Americans, people of color, and white Americans. The Denver Chamber of Commerce is involved in a really amazing program called Prosper Colorado. And I think if you look at, we can make sure, I guess you already probably have shared information on this, Elizabeth, but I think what's striking there is it shows those gaps, right, in income that contribute to wealth gaps, where an African-American woman with an advanced degree is earning an income that is often similar to a white person with a high school degree. I mean, those kind of gaps show you what leads to this wealth gap. Education gaps, and even the intergenerational inheritance savings that are passed from generation to generation that help grow wealth for families, and certainly would make a big difference for families of colors. So what we found is that home ownership of the pie of wealth is the biggest source of wealth building for all Americans. And in fact, for people of color, for Black families, for example, it comprises even a larger portion of wealth for those families as compared to white families. So for example, 53% of wealth for Black families is comprised of home ownership, whereas it's just 40% for white families. And that's because many white families have more diversity, right, in that wealth stack, if you want to call it. And so now, if you keep winnowing down into one of these main sources of wealth in terms of home ownership, that creates a huge disparity, because unfortunately, home ownership rates around the country and in Colorado and even in the Denver metro area, they're very similar. But so for example, in the Denver metro area, Black home ownership rate is 38%, whereas the rate of home ownership among white households is 70%. That, it makes it obvious why we have such a huge wealth gap. And I think one of the exhausting, as I sigh, facts that you read is that the homeownership rate of Black Americans in this country is below the rate of Black homeownership before the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. So what is the problem? I mean, we have laws on the books. Racism is illegal, right? But we continue to live in this legacy of gaps, and most certainly with wealth gaps. And when it comes to home ownership, what we have found statistically is that barriers to home ownership, one of the principal barriers is a lack of access to credit, a lack of access to capital for families. So as an example, there's a higher rate of mortgage denials for Black families and Latino families as compared to white families. That's really rooted into imbalanced debt to income ratios. Those who are, so many people of color are, and low income people are unbanked. So oftentimes they have no credit history or low credit history. And obviously the lack of savings that comes with housing instability really contributes to the inability to enter home ownership. So while these statistics are really sobering, we know, and I see so many comments on this conversation, we know that we have the tools. We now have the history, we understand what some of the barriers are and some of the systemic problems that have contributed to the wealth gap and education gap, all of the gaps. And so now we have an opportunity to address not just at an individual level, but really at a systemic level, bridging those gaps through tools that will increase access to capital, access to credit. And we can get into those solutions as we move forward, because I'm pretty confident I went over my time.
Time well spent.
And I'll stop sharing my screen, Jonathan, so that you can.
Sure. I would just ask one question for Maria. So it's a lot of that information really resonates because my brother, actually completely separate of any professional work, messaged me a couple months ago because he was doing a redlining research map to figure out where our family grew up in Philadelphia, and found that our family was in a redline district and we were homeowners. And so we asked our mom, how was it that we became homeowners? And the answer was essentially that our great grandmother was a maid in a wealthy Jewish household elsewhere in Philadelphia, and was able, she couldn't get loans or anything to buy a home in that area. So but she got him to be a co-signer on it and also to provide a loan. And so as a result, my great grandmother was a homeowner, and the path of our family moving, through Philadelphia and then many of us out of Philadelphia compared to our neighbors is a widely disparate story. So, all this is rooted in that. But, you mentioned, obviously these things are still perpetuating to this day. The end of your chart showed, the arrow going down for Black homeownership and up for white homeownership. So, and credit and everything else you mentioned being main barriers, but is there any specific policy specifically around credit that you guys are looking at to help Black homeowners and brown homeowners qualify for mortgages more often?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it, and I know we didn't have time to talk a lot about some of the advantages that allowed white families and white households to have home ownership all those years ago. GI Bill, down payment assistance, that kind of set them on that trajectory. That did you say it was your grandmother?
Great grandmother.
Yeah, was had to access through kind of outside of that system, right? So in terms of things that we're looking at right now, we're looking at credit building tools. How can we leverage things like good rental history, good utility payment history to help build, where folks don't have any credit history at all, help build that credit history that they need, and build that credit score so they could qualify for safe, affordable mortgages, for example. Down payment assistance. I know that down payment assistance targeted to families who were not able to benefit from things like the GI Bill, from some of those historic down payment assistance programs because of their race. We have a chance to step up now and do that. Some folks call that reparations, some call that something else, but I think that would be an important tool as well. Also, really credit count. I know it sounds really simple, but credit counseling, help negotiating some of those interest rates, those predatory loans that people are in, and modifying those mortgages so that folks can stay in their homes are other specific tools that we're looking at as well.
Great. Well, appreciate all that information. I'm going to pull up my slides, and I know we're low on time, so I promise to move through quickly. And Elizabeth, feel free to mute me. Give me one moment.
I will not be doing that, for the record. You teach away, please.
Let's see. Okay. So everyone can see this. So yeah, I will just move through it quickly though. So how does this all tie into the Black Lives Matter movement, right? The reason why we're talking about this today is because really of the murders of Joe Floyd and others over the course of the year. And then why is it that you have, it's almost all of us are housing, or actually all of us, all three of us are work in the housing world. So how does this all kind of tie together to the specifics of criminal justice? Let's see. So economics of current prisoners. So 8% of boys who were born into the lowest quartile of lowest income families end up in prison, compared to less than 1% of those who are born into the highest quartile or quintile. Or percentile, since there's more than 4, so it can't be quartile, can it? So if you look at pre-incarceration, and for every ascending income level, prison likelihood is cut in half. If you look at the percentage of people who are currently in prison, what their incomes were before they went to prison, about half of them were unemployed before incarceration, and those who make over $50,000 can constitute less than 2% of all prisoners. So, how does this kind of tie into housing? Well, as Maria said, housing is one of the first and most impactful indicators of generational wealth. So you have this long history of disenfranchisement. Maria already mentioned the homeownership rate disparity. The net worth of a white family is 7.5 times that of a typical Latinx family and 10 times that of a Black family. So poverty really, right, based on those other stacks, graphs, is just an epiphenomenon of poverty. Crime is an epiphenomenon of poverty. You got 86%, if you look at the, 86% of that pie chart of current US prisoners were earning $15,000 or less. And if you're born in that low income family, it's 20 times more likely you'll end up in prison. And then, just looking at Colorado, where Black people are 4% of the population, but 14% of arrests, 3 times the rate of what you'd expect normally. And it kind of all follows this pretty clear cascade of intentional policies over the years, and then the legacy of that. Now, when we look at crime, I think that it's important to know what we're talking about. This is Colorado crime statistics based on 2018 data, and nonviolent property theft is 4.9%, almost 50% of all of the crime. A lot of it is due to drugs, and when you get to actual murder, though, it's extremely small. I'll pull it up in a second here, but let's see. Yeah, so less than 10% of all crime in Denver. Less than 14% across Colorado. 24% of it is in Denver is comprised of disorderly conduct, trespassing, vandalism, alcohol abuse related issues. 40% of all crimes across the United States, of all thefts, are tied to substance misuse. So what you typically see is folks have a habit, an addiction, and are stealing in order to feed that habit. And in Colorado, it's 30% of all felony filings. Homicide is 0.09% of all crime in Colorado. I think we often have this idea that there's this, everything is law and order and, police dramas and serial killers. In reality, most crime is tied to poverty and addiction, and rarely ends up in murder. So what we have 4.4% of the world population, 20% of the world's prison population. Bringing it home to Colorado, $1 billion per year spent on prisons. What is that? 1,200% increase since 1990s. Right now, more people have been housed, in quotes, in prisons than have ever been housed in affordable housing programs in the state. Our incarceration rate is, as a state, is most comparable to El Salvador's. How does this show up in budgets? Well, cities spend, you kind of get what you pay for, right? So cities spend 30% of their budgets on police and corrections. That's kind of the average across the state. Looking at Aurora, it's 32% on police, 2% on neighborhood services. Looking to Colorado or to Denver, the public safety budget is twice that of human services, more than twice that. What are we doing with that money, though, that we're spending on police? Well, it takes longer to become a hairdresser than a police officer in Colorado. You spend a fraction of the time on de-escalation tactics, which is important since Black folks are 2 times as likely to be killed by police. CPR did an interesting report last year that showed that because we have a 50% recidivism rate, 20% of all the increase in crime over the previous couple of years were attributed to people who were coming out of the system, didn't have supports, and were committing offenses again. It wasn't new crime or new offenders. If you look at public safety funding at the state level, again, it's $2 billion for corrections and less than 3% of that on affordable housing. So let me stop sharing a moment. So yeah, try to sort of abbreviate and move quickly through that, but that's essentially how these poverty patterns show up in criminal justice and also in enhanced police interactions. I just want to be clear about one thing, is that police interactions, it's not just that poor people and poor Black people are committing crimes, right? I'm pretty sure that the per capita consumption of cocaine and designer drugs is higher in Aspen and Pitkin County than it is in most of these neighborhoods, right? It kind of depends on who's policed and how they're policed as well. So I think that's an important point to make. But all of this history added up, plus a really silly appropriation of dollars for programs that are pretty archaic and don't stop crime, contribute to this situation that we're currently in. And that's kind of how we've connected to housing and the criminal justice movement. I think it's interesting to note that Martin Luther King, back in right before he died, his last big initiative before he was assassinated, rather, was to focus on fair housing and economic justice. And then right after he was killed, kind of in his honor, you had the 1968 Fair Housing Act passed. So it's really more closely connected than I think we've looked at in the past. But I'll stop there. Okay.
No, I thank you. This was incredibly important to paint the picture of redlining. And it's such a clear, and this was happening in the chat feature, it's such a clear example of systemic racism and something that has been happening for a long time and is still very relevant today for us to focus on. And so I want to move us quickly to some solutions and how we can talk about this as a group. There were a lot of questions that were submitted in advance that I think you guys have answered as we've gone through. There are also a lot of questions still in the chat function, but I really want to dive into this one that, the deep racial disparities in housing, health, education, wealth, the criminal system that you touched on, Jonathan, they're all very much linked to each other. Talk to us about which one of these systems should we be addressing first? Is there one that rises to the top before another? How can we start to focus on this? And what are the different roles of different sectors, private, public? That's a loaded question, I know, but where can we start? Who's unmuted? Katie, you're unmuted and look like you're ready.
Yeah, I'm unmuted and definitely have a thought about that. I don't think there's one place that we start first. I think every single one of us needs to start in our own sphere of influence and in our own work. And so for me, that means I work in the housing system, and that's where my expertise is. And I'm most likely to be able to untangle some of the legacy of the past and put forward anti-racist solutions in that realm. Other people work in other sectors. I see, you know, folks in the for-profit sector, in government, in education, all on the line right now. And I think we can all start where we are.
Maria or Jonathan? Maria, you look like you're ready to add.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's no surprise. I'm going to, that's right. We need to start where we are. But I guess for me, housing is such an integral part, right? I mean, the guy who wrote The Color of Law even started writing this book because he was an education law expert and he wanted to examine discrimination in education, and he ended up with housing discrimination. I mean, that was the root of it. When you think of health, COVID, you know, I mean, we are seeing the vulnerabilities in our health system, and they relate so clearly to whether someone doesn't have housing at all or is housing unstable. So I do feel like, I mean, it's not gonna be a surprise, I work for Habitat for Humanity, right? That housing first, I'm drinking the housing first juice, because I just see it as, without shelter, you can't have the stability to go to school, to get healthy, to have any of the successes you would need to build wealth and build a secure future for your family. So I would say that. And then just really quickly, when you mention what we can do, you know, I talked about increasing access to credit and capital. It's not just about financial capital. I think because of the history of discrimination and segregation in our country, there's something about social capital. And I think about Jonathan's story right now as I'm thinking about how critically important this is. So if his great-grandmother didn't have contact with someone with means, now I know it was, you know, she worked for this family, but she was able to make a connection that helped her advance economically. If my kid is able to go to school with families that run their own businesses or have other opportunities, my kid could get a job or could get invited to participate in opportunities where they can have social capital that gives them access to economic capital. We saw with the Paycheck Protection Program, the lack of Black and Brown people who were able to subscribe to those funds that would make it possible for them to survive, these small businesses to survive the pandemic. Well, they didn't have relationship, social capital with the bankers that were necessary to access those loans. So I think what we can do is we can increase those opportunities. How many folks are part of the Black Chamber of Commerce, or how many folks have moved outside of their segregated even work spaces to really engage, to bump into people who are different than them, both economically and racially, and push. My recommendation would be to push yourself to do exactly that, so that you can learn about other ways that you can make a difference.
Agreed. And I'll just quickly add, so outside of housing, I think the other areas that are important to focus on are mental health. About a quarter of all people who were shot by the police are having a mental health incident at the time of the incident. And there's a lot of research out there. Denver's piloting a program that was modeled off of a program in Eugene, Oregon that many folks have probably heard about, called the CAHOOTS program, that was able to transfer 20% of all 911 calls to mental health professionals. And only 1% of all those calls ended up going back to the police. So extremely high rate of just taking those sort of situations that really aren't crime issues, they're socioeconomic and mental health issues, out of the hands of people with guns who don't need them for those situations. The other thing to note, especially speaking of this group, and I know we had some questions in advance about what to do from a business perspective. Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition has a program that recently got partially defunded, but because of the COVID crisis and the budget crisis. But their idea was to take money from the corrections budget and put it into the hardest hit by crime neighborhoods in Aurora and in Colorado Springs for financial education and business education and startup dollars for small businesses. So the question that we got in advance from you guys was, what can you do from a business perspective, specifically around gentrifying neighborhoods? And I really think it's using your skills to empower residents to build wealth, through businesses and entrepreneurship, and also to employ people that are in those neighborhoods. Because if you do that, then you're raising the economic profile of people in a way that allows them to not feel like they need to be, not be involuntarily displaced as property values rise. So in the absence of homes as assets, you need to empower them with financial resources and opportunities.
It's paining me that we don't have enough time. I think we need to add another hour. But I do want to call on Jonathan McMillan. He posed a question when he registered and is very active in the chat also, in talking about how these communities and cultures are being displaced and what we can do about that. So Jonathan, I'm going to give you the mic to ask your question out loud and frame it up.
Awesome. I remember to unmute myself.
Well
I have a lot of questions. I think you're asking about or you're referencing the question, or maybe more the comment of, as we talk about redlining and how it was such a racist, such racist policies led to a lot of these social determinant disparities. The thing that's forgotten and overlooked a lot is that a lot of these communities, Black, Brown, and other communities, built very rich cultures and communities within them. And so when we talk about residential desegregation and looking at how do we fix the issues of redlining, unfortunately, I think that we are unintentionally allowing displacement happening and the dismantling of these cultures and communities where a lot of us are finding our legacies, our histories in the things that came before us. Is that the question you were mentioning, Elizabeth?
Yeah, and you had mentioned in registration, how do we look to counteract that? Like, how can we, and this will lead to my final question actually for the panelists. So it's a perfect segue. And before I ask that, I want to thank the audience here. This is the most robust chat feature I've seen. You guys are answering a lot of your own questions with each other. So I really appreciate the action you're seeing there. So Jonathan, I'm gonna ask your question in a way that helps us set up our final question here for the group. And that is, we've talked about solutions. We've heard a lot about what's happening. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions here still, but what can this leadership community do? What can we do from our seats to help? And we know it's more education, we know there's actions to take, but what is your one piece of advice that you can leave us with so that we know what kind of action we can take? And Katie, you unmuted first, so you're up, my friend.
Sure, I'm quick with the mute button today. So Jonathan, I think you ask a really good question, and it's definitely the right question to be asking a lot of times. And I'm going to pull a little bit from some of the conversation in the chat too around land use, because I think that's really integral to this whole conversation. A lot of times in Denver, but not just in Denver, when we're having conversations about preventing involuntary displacement or the disruption of these really rich cultural and historical communities, we're looking for solutions only within that small community. So I live in the Globeville neighborhood, and there was a lot of conversation about we need more affordable housing, and so we should increase the types of zoning in our neighborhood so that we can get more affordable housing. And that's part of the solution, but I really think that we need to be looking citywide for these solutions, because as we've seen in 5 Points and now the Globeville area and Swansea area, when we are increasing residential density and allowing for more housing types in those communities, there's such market demand for it that it gets built, and it gets built at a very high income level that excludes the people who are typically living there. So we need to kind of flip this script and also look for these same solutions by integrating historically white neighborhoods as well. So those are the neighborhoods that have access to better schools, better infrastructure, you know, all kinds of a higher tree canopy. The list goes on and on and on. And so those are the neighborhoods that we also need to be thinking about in tandem with historic communities of color that are now becoming more white. We need to be thinking about integration holistically as a city, and a lot of that comes through our land use and the types of housing and building that's allowed to be built.
I'll just make one additional comment. I think Katie is bringing up such an important point, and it's something that as a person of color, I struggle with. Jonathan, you bring up the point of, you know, integration is important, and opportunities to move to neighborhoods with you know, rich in resources and schools and jobs and things like that is important. Having that option is important. But there's a lot to be said for what it means to a person of color to live in a community that has the cultural, some of those other support systems that help build up that person internally, right? And it's, as a person of color, I struggle in between these lines. And I just speaking to your question, what do you do to make this an and proposition and not an either or proposition? So yes, we definitely, and I will fight for the right to not keep the suburbs as some segregated, whatever we're hearing about recently in the news, place where nobody of a lower income or different skin color or ethnicity can live. But what are we doing to make sure we're preserving the opportunities for folks to stay near their churches, for the churches to even be able to stay where they are, for those cultural resources that help minorities feel that, you know, part of a community. And some of the things that I've learned from Katie actually around different tools are having preference policies when we're building. So when we're building affordable housing and home ownership opportunities, what are we doing to market and make sure that folks that are vulnerable to displacement get a look, you know, that they're knowing about these opportunities to live there? What kind of tools are we doing to, as these neighborhoods are integrated and growing, what are we doing to preserve affordable pricing, community land trusts, more community land trust opportunities, and ways to keep that housing affordable for those who already live there so they're not kicked on out, are some of those tools that we need to work hard to embed in our local policies.
You know, Katie and Maria, you guys hit basically everything that I was going to say. The specific example of the preference policy, Maria, is out in Portland, where every new building being built in historically redlined and gentrifying or gentrified neighborhoods, they open up the rooms, and if to people who previously had an address there in that neighborhood and can prove that they were displaced, and so they get the first look. So that's one way of having this new development benefit not just the current people, because often the ship has sailed, right, in terms of gentrification in many of these neighborhoods, but reestablishing that which was taken away from folks unjustly is one policy that's actually in practice right now in Portland. But I'll stop there.
Tremendous. The information rolling in the chat feature is amazing. You guys have really set us up for a thought-provoking conversation, something that we can all now take back, think about, learn more about, and kind of discuss and learn from. I want to take a moment to thank the three of you for putting together a spectacular opportunity for us to learn a bit more about this history and the current issues with redlining. This is a big deal, and we are happy to learn more. I want to thank the audience for being so active and engaged and caring deeply about this. We're going to close out with just a few reminders for you guys, but thumbs up, claps in your boxes for Maria, Katie, and Jonathan. You guys are truly spectacular, and we appreciate the time you've spent with us here today. We really
Can I say just one thing?
Please.
because, okay, I see 3 minutes. So one thing that I think is important, because it's always difficult when these sort of presentations where subject experts or professionals tell you about the issues in their field, and then it's like, okay, well, what do we do now? And this might sound a little kitschy, but just as an example, the most recent bill that was passed by the Colorado legislature preventing police violence, right? It was the ban on chokeholds, ban on indiscriminately firing rubber bullets into a crowd, ban on shooting people in the face, aiming at the face with rubber bullets. I think it's interesting to note that that bill existed before George Floyd's murder, and it didn't have a chance in hell of going anywhere. And then after the protests, after there was a public swell of support for this sort of thing, it then passed with bipartisan support almost completely across the board in the legislature. So a lot of these things, where there's housing first type programs, which are currently in Denver as pilots through the social impact bonds, a whole other thing, or the mental health approach, preference policy, these things are all fringe. Density and opportunities in both in higher income neighborhoods, where typically those things were banned. Those things are all fringe, and and whenever we go into in front of public officials, the ideas look completely radical and insane. And the only way to make them less radical is if we need to have people who aren't just defenders of like NIMBYism showing up at city council meeting and talking about this kind of stuff. Every time we go to a meeting, it's us versus everyone who is essentially against integration in some of these policies. So not, as a public swelled support is really important, but you guys in particular with what you do and your clout in the city, the more you can, the more people support things that were like quote unquote radical, the more likely they are to not be treated as radical anymore. And like I said, the criminal justice or the police violence bill is a perfect example of that. So I know I wasn't supposed to go longer, so sorry, Elizabeth, but that's it.
No. Anytime, Jonathan, truly, that's what we want to hear. This is why we have virtual voices. It's a conversation. I will now close out with just a few reminders. We have another virtual voices coming up in November. We're slowing down our cadence for the holiday season, so there'll be one in November, one in December, but our next one will be on technology today and really how that's helping us with school, with work, mental health, in different ways that it's helping, and or the access to it. And so we'll really dive deep into technology. So we hope to see you there. A few other just recruitment reminders. Impact Denver applications are due December 4th. This is our 6-month program where we spend half a day with leaders diving deep into issues facing our community. And we think you all are our best recruiters. If you've maybe not done it yourself, or you know people that might be interested in Impact Denver, we'd love to have you apply or pass it on. We also do Impact Denver nonprofit project proposals. If you are in a nonprofit or a board of a nonprofit or know somebody that might need some help from some leaders, we ask our Impact Denver leaders when they're in the program to work with a nonprofit and help them solve for a problem that they have. So we ask nonprofits to submit proposals to us. You'll see the deadline there as well. Happy to send information in our recap about all of this as well. And then finally, we just want to let you know, we have a new Alumni Giving Day coming up. We are looking to raise money for our Leading Colorado Scholarship Fund. We've seen an increase, much like the rest of the world. The need is strong, but we've seen an over 107% increase in scholarship requests so that leaders can be a part of our programming, and we don't want to turn anybody away. So we ask that you all consider on November 18th giving to Alumni Giving Day. Alumni or not, we certainly welcome your donations. But again, I will leave it with a big shout out and a big thank you to Maria, Jonathan, and Katie. This was tremendous, and thank you to the audience. We will have a recap out to you next week with all these amazing resources that you've seen here and a video link. Thank you all so much for being a part of Virtual Voices again.